that's very kind. I don't think anyone has ever associated a lecture by me with anything as lively as the return of spring before. I'm very grateful for that. I'm terribly grateful to be here. So an honour to take part in a programme as wonderful as the one that you've organised for Benedictus. It's a great initiative, which I much admire and commend, and I'm grateful to you all for supporting it. I think Claire's trying to do something that no one has ever done in this country since the Reformation, and that is to serve God as we try to do at the University of Notre Dame by bringing up young people in the Catholic tradition fearlessly wielding reason, science and scholarship in pursuit of truth. I'm not usually associated with dicta as solemn as that, and I suppose the less solemn part of the evening begins now, here. In April 1548, the deputy of the King of Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, was annotating his copy of Vitruvius in Latin, and on the fly-leaf wrote, "I read this book in the city of Mexico." And indeed, you know, all Spanish, practically all European colonies in the Americas bear the stamp of Vitruvius in their cities. You can see an example here. This is Mexico City, is painted by Cristobal de Villalpando in the 1690s. But of course, you know, classical inspiration wasn't the only reason why colonial cities were built on a grid pattern. But it was a big part of the reason. And in the very moment when Mendoza was reading Vitruvius in Mexico City, down the road in the College of Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco, young Aztec noblemen were learning how to write like Virgil and Cicero, and were perusing Plutarch and Lucretius. Within a few years, in Spanish colonies all over the Americas, people were learning how to sculpt and paint in imitation of Renaissance paintings, build in imitation of Renaissance buildings. Of course, in Mexico, a lot of indigenous composers were setting Nahuatl texts to polyphonic music. And already by that day, I mean, already in the 1490s, there were Portuguese craftsmen in the Kingdom of Congo building a palace for the Mani Congo in imitation of the royal palace in Lisbon. First time European culture had crossed the Sahara into the depths of Africa. And within a few years, the same sorts of resonances could be heard and felt in the extremities of South and East Asia, with, you know, the Emperor Akbar sending to Europe for engravings of the paintings of Dürer and other Renaissance artists, for his own court artists to copy. And a few years after that, you know, Jesuits were printing classical and patristic and humanistic texts in Goa and in Nagasaki, and not long after that, in the early 17th century, even in China. So the Renaissance really was, I mean, I hope we're not going to get involved in bickering about what the Renaissance meant. Professor's definition is terribly boring. If we just take some common sense notion of what the Renaissance was, we understand it as a movement in art and thought for retrieving with increasing intensity and revaluing with increasing commitment texts and values from classical antiquity. we understand the Renaissance in that sense. It really was the first global intellectual and artistic movement in the history of the world. Obviously so, because the Americas hadn't been accessible to movements of old world origin and vice versa until the 1490s. And obviously, that raises a big question. What was the appeal of the Renaissance to other cultures? If it's true that it was a European movement, inspired by aspects from European past, fragments, textual and physical remains from classical antiquity. And if it's true that it happened in Europe without requiring any input from outside, then it's a very remarkable event in the history of the world. And we want to know why other cultures responded to these European values so enthusiastically. But that's not what I'm going to talk about this evening. That is the subject of a paper that Peter Burke and I have written, which will be out soon, I hope. But I want to spend my time this evening looking at another problem that arises from the global resonance of the Renaissance. And that's, how did the Renaissance happen at all? Because again, if it's true that it was, a homegrown European movement, not substantially formed with input from other cultures, then it's without precedent or parallel in history. Because typically, great intellectual and artistic movements only happen as a result of the intersection and intercommunication of different cultures. And if it's true that the Renaissance is exceptional in this respect, then that is a tremendous boost to what we historians tend now to call the Eurocentric theory of history. The notion that modernity was made in the West and transmitted to the rest of the world as if it were a sort of Western gift to the rest of humankind. But we need to test that belief and ask whether it's really true. I think it's very easy to show that great intellectual and artistic movements depend on this, what I call interculturation, this intercommunication between cultures. For example, we look at this. It's a fairly famous relief carved in the 2nd century AD, probably early in the 2nd century AD, in Gandhara, in Central Asia. As you can see, the Trojan horse is being wheeled into Troy, and there's Cassandra, kind of trying to save the city. It takes a Greek myth, and there are clearly, classical elements, classical echoes in this sculpture. If you look at Cassandra, she looks more like, a kind of Indian houri or temple prostitute or something than a classical prophetess. And that, of course, is because this work ideally represents the way in classical and Hellenistic times traffic back and forth across Eurasia shunted artistic and intellectual influences along with it and created these hybrid civilizations, these hybrid cultures in which you can see the fertilizing effects of the conjunction of influences from the opposite extremities of Eurasia. And if we look ahead to the culture of the High Middle Ages, the same is true. Here you can see a famous painting of the Polo brothers bringing a letter from Kublai Khan to Gregory X. And we're in another period of intense communications across Eurasia, and in my submission, the high culture of medieval Europe, which depended so much on ideas and technology of Chinese origin, would never have happened had it not been for that period under the Song and Yuan dynasties, when trans-Eurasian communications were vibrant and frequent. And if we look at a couple of diagrams, I think one can see very simply, really, why this is. These diagrams are my attempt really to illustrate diagrammatically Jared Diamond's famous theory about why Eurasia pullulates with cultural initiatives compared with other parts of the world. And essentially, it's because the intercommunicability of all these different cultures. Well, they know that they overlap, there are opportunities for transmission of cultural influences between them in a way that isn't possible. I'm sorry, I think we've broken into Spanish here, but I think it's intelligible Spanish. In these other civilizations in other parts of the world, they've been relatively laggard in innovation. Not because people who live in these places are stupid, but because they're isolated, because they don't have that opportunity to exchange ideas with other cultures and generate the seismic effects that happen when ideas rub up against one another. Essentially, ideas are like organisms in that they breed. You need to put them together in order to generate new thinking. And so, before the Renaissance, the culture, civilization, classical antiquity, the Hellenistic period, the Middle Ages, depended on these trans-Eurasian exchanges. And I would like to suggest that after the Renaissance, you can see the same, see other similar phenomena, you can see the same thing happening again. And in order to show that, I'd like to take you to the Bay of Nagasaki in the late 18th century. Well, I'm fairly confident that there were no mermaids in Nagasaki Bay in the late 18th century, but in a sense, the man who was responsible for this illustration, the book it illustrates, went there in search of mermaids. Because this is an illustration from a work by Otsuki Gentaku, a Japanese scholar who developed an interest in monsters, prodigies, mirabilia, especially unicorns, and mermaids were a bit of a sideline with her. And on an October morning in 1785, he set off for Nagasaki in order to learn about unicorns and mermaids by finding someone who would teach him Dutch. Because, as you know, in that period, the Dutch were apart from the Chinese, the only foreigners allowed to trade in Japan. The Japanese intellectuals could only access Western learning through the medium of Dutch. So, in order to find out the latest about unicorns and mermaids, Otsuki Gentaku goes off in search of a Dutch tutor. And he's lucky enough to recruit for this purpose the author of this work, Sugito Genpaku, the leading expert in Western science in Japan at the time. Well, that's not saying much, because they knew so little about Western science in Japan at the time. This work is and you can see, you need to look at this to see what I mean about cultural hybridity. You can see that here you've got a Japanese work transposed onto a European frontispiece. And that's because what we're looking at is Sugito Genpaku's own selection of passages in translation from a Dutch anatomical work, the Ontledkundige Tafelen, which was itself a translation from a a German work. Now, if it weren't a terrible pun in the context of Japanese history, I'd say this was a work produced by Chinese whistlers. So here you've got this Japanese version of a Western scientific work, which for the Japanese represented the latest thing, although it was many generations out of date by European standards. And here you can see one of the illustrations from it that Sugito Genpaku copied for the Japanese edition. And in Sugito Genpaku's own autobiography, he describes how painful and demanding a process learning Dutch was. He says rather proudly that at the end of a year of studying every day, he and his companions, classmates, were able to translate, he says, as much as 10 lines in a day, provided it wasn't too difficult. And this is a measure, really, of the heroism involved in these long-range cultural exchanges. But at the very moment when Otsuki Genpaku set off in October 1785 for Nagasaki, this rose at dawn in Krishnagar in order to get in a few hours of study of Sanskrit before his official duties as a British judge began. Because this, of course, is Sir William Jones, the discoverer of, that's not too portentous a word, of Indo-European. And just as those Japanese guys were sweating away in order to master a Western language, so William Jones was engaging in comparable lucubrations in order to master Sanskrit, which he valued more highly, according to his own account, than Latin and Greek, which is a pretty big thing for a European in the 18th century to do. So these exchanges are not unidirectional. We're talking about exchanges across the span of Eurasia between East and West, generating the movement which we loosely call the Enlightenment. And here's Leibniz, and I think Leibniz expressed, there's a word, slightly late edition, I think the original edition was 1697. Leibniz was reporting on Chinese science and literature on the basis of reports from Jesuit missionaries. And this is one of the things that he says, which I think does evoke for us. I don't think anybody would put it like this nowadays, but this evokes for us how exchanges across Eurasia enriched all the cultures that they touch, both those at the extremities and those along the way. So we've got vast movements of cultural, intellectual, artistic innovation being stimulated in antiquity, in the Hellenistic period, in the Middle Ages, and in the Enlightenment by a repeated pattern of long-range cultural exchange. But what about the Renaissance? Why does the Renaissance apparently not conform to this model? Well, I suppose to some extent, before I go on to that, I suppose I was just going to show you a few slides just to convince you that the Enlightenment really was dependent on Oriental influences. And this is, for example, Georg Meister's work on Japanese and Javanese gardens, which is the first work on Japanese gardens in the West. And Meister accompanied Engelbert Blanford's embassy to Japan in 1658, and this was the result. And of course, in the 18th century, European gentlemen and monarchs did begin to surround themselves with a kind of pseudo-Chinese environment. Everybody will recognize William James's Chinese pagoda in Kew Gardens. I mean, one could multiply these examples infinitely. This is a particular favourite of mine. This is the Duke of Cumberland's Chinese-style yacht on Virginia water. And I just do love to console myself with the thought that when bloody butcher Cumberland wasn't massacring Highlanders, he was lolling around on his Chinese-style yacht. His capacity for innocent enjoyment was just as great as any honest man's. I have to show you this example, because this is one of the Chinese rooms lined with porcelain in the Royal Palace of Madrid, designed by Reynolds in 1759. And you know, if you've been around Bourbon palaces of the 18th century in Europe, you'll know that you can't throw a brick in one without breaking porcelain. and indeed, they've all got Chinese rooms, typically entirely lined with porcelain. And when the money ran out, they would put sort of Chinese salt wallpaper and stuff. I show this because not only does it show these European elites literally surrounding themselves with a Chinese-style environment, informing the whole way they live, but it also had tremendous political significance. Because, for example, in the court of Spain in this period, they were performing court dramas based on Chinese themes or derived from real Chinese works, in order specifically to provide the king with models of good governance, Chinese models of good governance, the same models as are recommended by Voltaire and Duquesne and their followers. The whole enlightened notion of benevolent despotism is deeply indebted to these Chinese influences. But what about the Renaissance? How does it conform to these models? And I suppose it depends what you mean by the Renaissance. It depends when you think it started. And of course it didn't start. The Renaissance doesn't have a starting point. It's a process. It's an accretion of accumulating and accelerating traditions which were never entirely lost in Europe. But in one moment in that process of acceleration was obviously in the 1340s, the age of Petrarch and Boccaccio. And in that decade, this was painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in Siena. I expect everybody recognizes this famous painting of the martyrdom of Franciscans. And in this period, Lorenzetti could show the martyrdom as a kind of, dramatic, theatrical performance, watched by the entire world, with all these, Oriental types peering from the balcony. At about the same time, I think it's probably when it actually was Lorenzetti was painting this painting, Baldassare Pegolotti was writing the Libro della Praticatura, which was a guide for European merchants going to China. Wonderful text. It's like the sort of 14th century equivalent of the rough guide. He tells you where to get your hair cut, where to swap, your oxen for mules. He tells you where to get prostitutes. Nothing, that the mercantile traveller of the age required is omitted from this text. So if you think of the Renaissance as a phenomenon of the age of Petrarch and Boccaccio, there kind of isn't a problem, because it is happening at a time of intense intercommunication across Eurasia, when Europeans are going to China and coming back in significant numbers. But this is almost the last moment when that is possible for a very long time. So if you look here, this is a little vignette from the Catalan Atlas, compiled in the late 1370s, early 1380s. And here you can see a caravan of European merchants returning from Cathay. And this was, as I say, painted about late 1370s, early 1380s. And by that time, this scene was impossible, because the Ming Revolution of 1368 had severed the Mongol peace and put an end to that era of travel, trade, communication across Eurasia. So much so, I mean, the interruption was so total to these communications that when Columbus set off in 1492, as you know, his whole project was focused on finding a way to China to replace this severed artery of communications. And here you can see one of the illustrations from his first report of his discoveries in 1493. And although this illustration has been widely misinterpreted, it's pretty obvious that it's showing, supposedly Oriental merchants trading with the people whom Columbus discovered in the Caribbean. But as you know, on his first voyage, Columbus carried letters from the King and Queen of Spain to the Grand Khan, a title the ruler of China hadn't had since 1368. I mean, that's how out of date they were. That's how cut off China and Europe were. In the 15th century, in the Quattrocento, in the period that we typically think of as that when the Renaissance was fully forged. So on the face of it, it does look as though the Renaissance is something that happened in a Europe isolated from the context that had nurtured every other great intellectual and artistic movement of the past, and would continue to nurture great artistic and intellectual movements in the future. So we're looking at a very anomalous, apparently looking at a very anomalous event. And yet, scholars are constantly troubled by suspicions that somehow or other Chinese influences must have percolated through and sparked innovation in Europe in this period. The two very conspicuous examples that inspire this kind of thinking. First is this, printing. We're looking here at what I think is the oldest surviving book in the world, printed with movable type, the Ji Korean work of the 1370s. But of course, we know from other sources that the Chinese and the Koreans had had movable type for a long time before this. And although the printing press is a European invention, it does seem to depend on knowledge of this prior technology. And it's very hard to convince oneself that these inventions could have happened entirely independently of one another. That's not, of course, impossible, but it's a conclusion which people are only willing to espouse when they've investigated and rejected the other possibilities. So printing is one of those things that makes people think, well, there's got to be some Chinese influence around in 15th century Europe. And the other is this. Instantly recognizable landscape by Leonardo. I mean, it's a new art, it's a new genre in late 15th century Europe. Unpeopled landscapes had never appeared in European art before. And when one looks at this, it is very hard, I think, to resist the impression that Leonardo must have known the Chinese landscape tradition. Because, I mean, the whole, way the brushwork is effected is remarkably reminiscent of Chinese techniques. So, it's not surprising, therefore, that for a long time in the early 20th century, scholars were ransacking Renaissance art for supposed evidence of Chinese and Indian and other Oriental influences. And I think these works are probably, the most impressive in that tradition. They do amount to, I think, a very considerable input of effort on the part of Western scholars to demonstrate